Don't dye your hair yet. I know how that sounds. Maybe you've been doing this every 4 to 6 weeks for years, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, gloves on, timer set, hoping this time the color comes out even. But here's what I want you to actually hear. What's happening to your hair isn't a flaw. It's not something you did wrong. It's a biological process. And once you understand what's actually driving it, you have real tools to work with it, not just cover it up. Stick with me for the next little while, because I'm going to walk through the actual biology, step by step, then give you a full protocol, and at the end, I'll answer the questions people always ask me about this. Let's start with something most people get completely backwards. Everyone assumes gray hair is just genetics, a switch that flips at a certain age, and that's that. Nothing you can do. But that's only part of the story. Your hair color comes from cells called melanocytes. They live inside your hair follicles, and their job is to produce a pigment called melanin. When you're young, these cells are active, productive, pumping out color with every new strand that grows. Here's what changes as you get older. Somewhere around your mid-30s, a molecule most people never think about starts quietly, building up inside your hair follicles. Hydrogen peroxide. Yes, the same compound you might have in a brown bottle under your bathroom sink. Your body actually makes small amounts of this naturally, all the time, in every cell. Normally, an enzyme called catalase breaks it down before it causes any trouble. But as you age, catalase production slows down. Less catalase means more hydrogen peroxide sitting around. And hydrogen peroxide, left unchecked, does exactly what you'd expect. It slowly damages those pigment-producing melanocytes. It bleaches them from the inside. This connection between declining catalase, rising hydrogen peroxide, and hair turning gray has actually been documented in published biology research, including studies looking at hair follicles across different age groups. The pattern is consistent. Less catalase, more peroxide, less pigment. So here's the real takeaway. Gray hair isn't just a calendar event. It's a biochemical shift. And biochemical shifts can sometimes be influenced. Not always fully reversed, not overnight, but influenced. Now, before I get into nutrients, I want to cover something almost nobody talks about, because it changes how you think about this whole topic. Stress. You've probably heard the phrase, "she went gray overnight from the stress." For a long time, that was treated as just a dramatic expression, not real biology. But research in the last several years has actually given this idea some genuine scientific backing. Here's the mechanism in simple terms. Deep inside your hair follicles, there's a small reserve of what are called melanocyte stem cells. Think of these as the backup supply, the cells waiting in reserve to become active pigment-producing melanocytes when needed. Under chronic stress, your body releases a chemical called norepinephrine as part of your fight-or-flight response. Researchers found that norepinephrine can cause these stem cells to activate all at once, and then, essentially, burn out. They differentiate rapidly, do their job once, and then the reserve supply is gone. Unlike other stem cells in your body that can replenish themselves, once this particular reserve is depleted, it does not appear to come back. So chronic, ongoing stress doesn't just make you feel exhausted. It may be quietly draining the exact reserve your body needs to keep producing hair pigment over the long run. This is why managing stress isn't just a nice-to-have wellness tip. In the context of gray hair, it may be directly protective of the very cells we're trying to support with nutrition. I'll come back to some practical stress reduction habits a bit later, but I wanted you to understand why it matters at the cellular level, not just as generic advice. Okay, so between hydrogen peroxide accumulation and stress-driven stem cell depletion, what do you actually do about it? Let's get into it. There's a nutrient that plays a direct role in supporting your body's catalase system. Most people have never heard of it, because it doesn't get talked about on morning TV or in the vitamin aisle at your local pharmacy. It's called PABA, para-aminobenzoic acid. PABA is considered part of the B vitamin family, sometimes referred to as B10, and researchers have been curious about its connection to hair pigmentation for decades now. One of the earliest studies, going back to the 1940s, looked at giving PABA to people experiencing early graying, and researchers observed some participants showing visible changes in hair color over time. It's an old study, small, and not the kind of large, modern clinical trial we'd want to lean on heavily. But it planted a question that researchers have kept coming back to ever since. Does supporting this specific pathway actually change hair pigmentation. And more recent, smaller studies combining PABA with other B vitamins, like pantothenic acid and folic acid, have reported similar observations in some participants. I want to be straightforward with you. This isn't a guaranteed fix, and results vary quite a bit from person to person. But the underlying mechanism is worth understanding, because it's genuinely interesting biology. Here's the analogy I like to use. Think of your hair follicle like a small factory. Catalase is the machine on the line that breaks down waste product, in this case, hydrogen peroxide. As you age, that machine slows down. It's still there, it's just not running at full capacity anymore. PABA appears to act like a raw material, a supply that helps keep that machine running. There's a second piece to this. PABA has also been studied for its potential role in supporting an enzyme called tyrosinase. Tyrosinase is the enzyme melanocytes rely on to actually produce melanin pigment in the first place. No tyrosinase activity, no pigment. So the theory goes, support that raw material, potentially support pigment production, on top of protecting the cells from peroxide damage. And there's a third piece that gets almost no attention, your gut. Trillions of bacteria live in your digestive tract, and some of them produce B vitamins. Your body then absorbs and uses, including small amounts of compounds related to PABA. Research has shown that gut bacteria composition shifts as we age, and some of the strains associated with B vitamin production tend to decline over time. It's one more thread connecting overall gut health to something as specific as hair pigmentation, which honestly still surprises me every time I read into it. So to bring it together, hydrogen peroxide buildup, tyrosinase decline, stress-driven stem cell depletion, and shifting gut bacteria, 4 different angles, all pointing at the same underlying system. If you're finding this interesting so far, this is exactly the kind of deep dive I like doing on this channel, taking a symptom everyone brushes off, and actually tracing it back to what's happening at the cellular level. So if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming. Now, before the main protocol, let's talk about a few other nutrients that come up constantly in this conversation, because I don't want to give you a one-nutrient view of something this complex. Copper deficiency has been linked in some research to premature graying, because copper is a required cofactor for tyrosinase, that same melanin-producing enzyme we discussed. Foods like cashews, dark chocolate, and shellfish are naturally rich in copper. Vitamin B12 deficiency is another one worth mentioning. Low B12 has been associated with premature graying in several observational studies, particularly in people following strict plant-based diets without supplementation, since B12 is primarily found in animal products. If you're vegan or vegetarian, this is genuinely worth getting checked with a simple blood test. Biotin, another B vitamin, gets talked about a lot for hair health generally, though the evidence specifically for pigmentation, rather than hair strength and growth, is weaker. Still worth having adequate levels, since outright biotin deficiency can affect hair quality overall. And iron, low iron, or full-blown iron deficiency anemia, has been connected to hair changes broadly, including some reports of premature graying, most likely through impaired oxygen delivery to the follicle. I mention all of these because gray hair is very rarely caused by just one missing nutrient. It's usually a combination, and that's exactly why whole food approaches, rather than single isolated supplements, tend to make more practical sense. Which brings us to the food I actually want you to focus on. There's a food source of PABA that's more practical, more accessible, and arguably more useful than taking an isolated supplement pill. It's something a lot of people already have sitting in their kitchen cabinet: blackstrap molasses. Blackstrap molasses is the thick, dark syrup left over after sugarcane has been boiled down multiple times to extract the sugar crystals. Basically, it's what remains after almost everything sweet has been removed, and what's left behind is surprisingly nutrient-dense. It naturally contains PABA, but more importantly, it comes packaged with cofactors, things like copper, iron, magnesium, and additional B vitamins, that work together with PABA rather than in isolation. Copper specifically plays a role in supporting tyrosinase, the same enzyme we talked about a minute ago. Iron supports oxygen delivery to the follicle. It's a whole small team of nutrients working toward the same goal, rather than one isolated compound trying to do all the work alone. Here's a simple way you could try incorporating it, if you're curious. 1 tablespoon of unsulfured blackstrap molasses, dissolved into a cup of warm water. Unsulfured matters here, because sulfur-treated versions can interfere with copper absorption. Warm, not boiling hot, since high heat can degrade some of the more delicate B vitamins. Stir it until it's fully dissolved, and many people prefer drinking it first thing in the morning, before coffee, before breakfast, on an empty stomach, since that's generally when mineral absorption tends to be more efficient. Now, let's talk timeline, because I want to manage expectations honestly here. Hair pigmentation is slow biology. You're not applying a dye. You're potentially shifting an internal biochemical environment, and that kind of shift takes time, if it happens at all for a given person. In the first few weeks, some people notice their hair simply feels healthier overall, a bit more shine, less brittleness. That's likely just improved overall nutrition status, not pigment change yet. Around the 2-month mark, some people report that new gray growth seems to slow down slightly. Existing gray strands are still there, but the rate of new ones appearing seems to ease off a bit. By month 3 or 4, if repigmentation is going to show up at all for a given individual, this tends to be the window where people report noticing it, often at the root first, a slightly darker band near the base of new hair growth. That would be the first physical sign that something is shifting at the follicle level. I'll say this clearly. Not everyone will see this. Individual biology varies enormously, and this is still an area that needs a lot more rigorous, modern research before we can make strong promises. But understanding the mechanism gives you a reasonable, low-risk thing to experiment with, especially since blackstrap molasses is just food, not a drug. Now, there's a second piece I want to add to this, because it works through a completely different pathway, and combining the two seems to make more sense than doing just one. Rosemary oil scalp massage. I know that sounds unrelated at first, but stick with me. A study published a few years back in a dermatology journal found that scalp massage increases blood circulation to hair follicles and stimulates the cells responsible for follicle health. When you add rosemary oil into that massage, you're adding a compound called carnosic acid, which has been studied for antioxidant properties. Separately, rosemary oil has been compared to minoxidil, the common over-the-counter hair growth treatment, in small clinical trials looking at hair density, with some promising results after several months of consistent use. For pigmentation specifically, the logic is simpler than for hair growth. More blood flow to the follicle means more efficient delivery of whatever nutrients you're beformed, including the PABA and cofactors from that molasses drink. Better delivery, at least in theory, supports better follicle function overall. Here's a simple version of the protocol, if you want to try it. Twice a week, mix about 5 drops of rosemary essential oil with a tablespoon of a carrier oil. Jojoba or coconut oil both work fine, and massage it into your scalp using small circular motions for about 5 minutes. Some people prefer leaving it in overnight and washing it out in the morning. Now let's circle back to stress, because I promised you some practical steps there too, and this ties directly into that melanocyte stem cell reserve we talked about earlier. You don't need a complicated meditation practice to make a difference here, though that certainly helps if you already do one. Even simple, consistent things matter. A short walk outside daily has been shown in multiple studies to lower circulating stress, hormones. Slow, deep breathing for even 5 minutes, a few times a day, activates your parasympathetic nervous system, essentially telling your body it's safe to stand down from that fight-or-flight state. And sleep, consistently getting 7 to 8 hours matters more than almost anything else on this list, because poor sleep itself raises those same stress hormone levels we're trying to avoid. None of this is going to instantly stop gray hair, but if chronic stress is quietly draining your melanocyte stem cell reserve in the background, addressing it isn't optional, it's foundational. You could do everything else perfectly and still be working against yourself if chronic stress is left completely unmanaged. Now, there's one more piece of this whole picture that I think deserves honest attention, because it might be working against you without you realizing it. Hair dye itself. Most permanent hair dyes rely on a compound that reacts with hydrogen peroxide to actually produce color, which means every time you apply permanent dye, you're introducing more hydrogen peroxide directly onto your scalp and into your hair follicles, the exact same molecule we talked about earlier as a driver of melanocyte damage. Some research has associated long-term regular use of oxidative hair dyes with elevated markers of oxidative stress in the scalp. It's not proof that dye alone causes gray hair to spread faster. Correlation isn't causation. but it's a reasonable thing to be aware of if you're in gray, actively trying to work on this from the inside. If you want to reduce that exposure, a gentler option is transitioning toward henna-based or semi-permanent color options that don't require a peroxide developer. You don't have to do this overnight, but it's worth knowing about if you're serious about addressing the root cause rather than just managing the appearance. Let's put the full protocol together now so you have it all in one place. 1. Each morning, on an empty stomach, 1 tablespoon of unsulfured blackstrap molasses dissolved in warm water. 2. Twice weekly, a 5-minute rosemary oil scalp massage, 5 drops of rosemary essential oil in a tablespoon of carrier oil. 3. Daily stress management, even something as simple as a short walk and a few minutes of slow breathing. 4. Reasonable copper and B12 intake through diet, checking with your doctor if you suspect a deficiency, especially if you're on a plant-based diet. 5. Gradually reducing reliance on peroxide-based permanent hair dye if you're serious about addressing the underlying cause. And 6. Consistency, for a minimum of 3 to 4 months before expecting to see anything, and understanding that individual results genuinely vary. Now let me answer a few questions I hear constantly about this topic. First question, is this backed by strong modern clinical research? Honestly, partially. The catalase and hydrogen peroxide mechanism is well-documented science. The stress and melanocyte stem cell connection has solid published research behind it too. The PABA-specific repigmentation studies are older and smaller than I'd like, and haven't been repeated at scale with modern trial standards. So think of this as a reasonable, low-risk, evidence-informed experiment, not a guaranteed medical treatment. Second question, will this work for everyone? No. Genetics still plays a real role in when and how much you gray, and for some people, that genetic component may simply outweigh anything nutritional. This approach is about giving your biology the best possible support, not overriding genetics entirely. Third question, can I do this alongside hair dye if I'm not ready to stop? Yes, absolutely. The molasses and rosemary oil protocol doesn't require you to stop dyeing immediately. Reducing peroxide exposure over time is simply one additional lever, not an all-or-nothing requirement. Fourth question, are there any risks? Blackstrap molasses is high in natural sugar content, so if you have blood sugar concerns or diabetes, talk to your doctor before adding a daily tablespoon. Rosemary oil should always be diluted in a carrier oil, never applied directly to skin, and if you're pregnant, check with your doctor first, since some sources advise caution with rosemary oil during pregnancy. So here's where all of this lands. Gray hair isn't simply a switch that flips with age. It's connected to a specific biochemical system, catalase, hydrogen peroxide, melanocyte stem cells, chronic stress, and even your gut bacteria. Understanding that system doesn't guarantee a full reversal for everyone, and I want to be honest about that, but it does give you real, low-risk, food-based and lifestyle-based options to experiment with, rather than just accepting dye as the only tool available. And I'll say this too, gray hair isn't something to be ashamed of. Plenty of people wear it proudly, and that's a completely valid choice. This information is for the people who feel like gray hair showed up earlier than they expected, and who want to understand what's actually happening at a biological level, whether they choose to act on it or not. If you decide to try any of this, give it real time, several months at minimum, and always check with your own doctor first, especially if you're taking other medications or supplements, since molasses and rosemary oil can interact with certain conditions. If this kind of deep dive is useful to you, subscribe, because next time I'm breaking down another everyday habit that quietly affects how your body ages. And trust me, it's going to surprise you just as much as this one did. I'll see you in the next one.